It was the middle of summer, on the Cape Brindle waterfront. Striped canvas awnings, the smell of hot crab cakes drifting out of open kitchen doors. Tourists filling every chair on the dock. Elena Marlowe, billionaire founder of Marlowe Capital, walked straight up to a stranger's table. The man sitting there, sunburned, quiet, eating lunch with his two little girls, looked up just in time to hear her say it. "Marry me. I'll help you raise your daughters." The entire restaurant went silent. Behind her, a group of wealthy friends stifled laughter. The man didn't smile. He didn't laugh either. He just looked at her, and somehow that was worse. If you're new here, this channel tells stories about real human dignity, the kind that doesn't make headlines, but changes everything. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Nolan Pierce was not the kind of man who asked for help. You could tell just by looking at him, the worn collar of his linen shirt, the jeans faded at the knees from kneeling on boat decks, the work boots permanently stained with salt and engine grease. He was 38 years old and looked like someone who had carried something heavy for a long time without ever setting it down. Not broken, just shaped by it. The way driftwood gets shaped by the tide, worn smooth in some places, stubborn and solid in others. He ran a small boat repair shop near the Cape Brindle Marina called Pierce Marine. It wasn't much: a corrugated metal roof, 2 hydraulic lifts, a pegboard wall covered in tools he'd owned since his 20s. But it was his. He'd built the business with his hands after his wife Rachel got sick. He'd turned down a senior engineering contract in Boston to stay home and take care of her. When she died 3 years ago in a boating accident on the bay, a freak collision on a clear morning that made no sense to anyone, least of all to Nolan, he stayed in Cape Brindle anyway. Because the girls were there. Because the water was there. Because leaving felt like admitting that none of it had meant anything. His daughters were the whole shape of his life. Tessa was 9, sharp-eyed and fearless, the kind of kid who argued with her teacher about constellations and was usually right. She kept hand-drawn star maps taped to the ceiling above her bed, and once spent an entire Saturday trying to calculate the distance to Andromeda using a library book and a piece of graph paper. She had Rachel's stubborn jaw and Nolan's tendency to go very quiet when she was upset. June was 7. Where Tessa was loud, June was still the kind of still that made adults underestimate her. She rarely spoke in groups, but she could disassemble and reassemble the carburetor on Nolan's old outboard motor faster than most of his hired hands. She remembered every mechanical detail she had ever been shown, filed it away somewhere behind those dark, careful eyes, and waited until she needed it. She was the one who still sometimes reached for Rachel's side of the closet before catching herself. Nolan held the 3 of them together the only way he knew how: by showing up every day without drama. Elena Marlowe arrived in Cape Brindle on the first Friday of July, the way wealthy people arrive at coastal towns in summer, by private car, with luggage that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and with the quiet assumption that the town would simply arrange itself around her. She was 41. Founder and CEO of Marlowe Capital, a private investment firm with holdings in biotech, clean energy, and commercial real estate across 11 states. Her name appeared in financial publications roughly 4 times a year, always in connection with a deal closed, a fund launched, or a rival outmaneuvered. She was photographed at galas in silk the color of champagne, always composed, always slightly apart from the crowd, even when standing in the center of it. The villa she rented on the bluff above the bay had floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides and a private dock she never used. She told herself she came to Cape Brindle to rest. What she meant was that she came to be somewhere no one needed anything from her, which was different from rest, though she hadn't figured that out yet. She brought friends, or the people who functioned as friends in her world. A hedge fund manager named Derek, a gallery owner named Paige, and a man named Conrad Vale, her former CFO, who laughed a little too easily and watched everything a little too closely. Conrad had been pushed out of Marlowe Capital 8 months ago after an internal audit uncovered misappropriated fund allocations and manipulated personnel records. He had signed the separation agreement without argument. If Elena had been paying closer attention, should have told her something. Men like Conrad didn't go quietly unless they were already planning something else. He still moved through her social circle the way a stone moves through still water, slowly leaving rings. On his second morning in Cape Brindle, while Elena slept in and Derek and Paige argued over brunch reservations, Conrad walked alone to the marina. He stood at the harbor fence for a while, coffee in hand, looking at nothing in particular. Then, he noted which boat slip belonged to Pierce Marine, which truck was parked outside, and what time the shop lights came on. He filed that information away and walked back to the villa without mentioning it to anyone. It was a Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday in July that felt like the whole summer had been building toward it. 90 degrees by 11 in the morning, the harbor glittering so hard it hurt to look at. Every table at Blue Lantern Dockside full by noon. Nolan had promised the girls lunch after finishing a hull repair on Tommy Garrett's fishing boat, a job that had taken 4 hours longer than expected and left him with grease on his forearms he hadn't fully scrubbed off. Tessa had already claimed the corner table by the window before he'd finished parking the truck. June had arranged her seashell collection, 3 pieces she carried in her jacket pocket, in a careful line along the edge of the table, and was studying them with the focused attention most children reserved for screens. It was supposed to be a quiet hour. Crab cakes and lemonade, and maybe if the girls behaved, one of the key lime tarts from the display case by the register. Nolan was looking at the menu, even though he ordered the same thing every time. He didn't notice Elena's table right away. It was loud in the restaurant, ceiling fans pushing hot air around the clatter of trays and tourist conversations, and someone's toddler shrieking happily near the door. Elena and her group occupied a long table by the bar, 3 rounds of drinks already on the surface. The particular looseness of people who had been in the sun all morning and were now comfortably insulated from consequence. Conrad sat at the far end of the table, quieter than the others, turning his glass slowly in his hand. Nolan heard the laughter first. Sharp, bright, slightly performative, the laughter of people doing something for each other's benefit. He didn't look up. He should have. The dare had started as a joke about who among them had the nerve to do something genuinely ridiculous in public. Derek had already walked up to a table of strangers and asked if he could finish their fries. Conrad had suggested something cruder that nobody took him up on. The game had a loose, stupid energy to it, the kind that only exists among people who have never had to worry about the consequences of their own behavior. Elena had looked around the restaurant for a target. Her eyes landed on Nolan's table, a man alone with 2 small girls, quiet, unremarkable, the kind of person her world moved around without ever touching. She thought it would be funny. She thought it would take 10 seconds. She thought it wouldn't mean anything. She was wrong about all 3. She crossed the restaurant with the calm of someone accustomed to entering rooms and being noticed. She stopped at the edge of Nolan's table. Tessa looked up first, then June, then Nolan, and by then, Elena was already saying it. "Marry me. I'll help you raise your daughters." The words landed like something dropped from a height. For 2 full seconds, the section of the restaurant around them went completely silent. A woman at the next table lowered her fork. Someone near the bar raised a phone. Tessa went very still, the way she did when something embarrassed her in public. Shoulders drawn in, eyes dropped to the table. June closed her fingers around the largest of her 3 shells and held it. Nolan looked at Elena for a long moment. Then he looked past her at the group by the bar, at Conrad, watching with a calculating stillness that had nothing to do with amusement, at Paige already laughing with her hand over her mouth. He understood immediately and completely what was happening. He set the menu down. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Not angry, something more controlled than angry, which was somehow worse. "You don't know me," he said. "You don't know my girls. And whatever's funny about this to your friends over there," he glanced briefly toward the bar, "it's not funny from here. These are my kids. They're not a prop." He reached into his back pocket, pulled out his wallet, and laid 2 20s on the table without counting them. He stood up. "Tessa, June, let's go." Tessa slid off her chair without a word. June carefully placed her shells back into her jacket pocket one by one before she followed. The three of them walked out through the front door into the white-hot noon sun, and the door swung shut behind them with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Elena stood at the edge of the empty table. The laughter behind her had already faded into something quieter and more uncomfortable. The ceiling fans turned. The restaurant resumed its noise. She didn't move for a long moment. She was trying to identify the feeling that had just settled in her chest. Unfamiliar, low, and heavy. It took her until she was back at the bar, back in her seat, back among her friends, to realize what it was. She was ashamed. At the end of the table, Conrad refilled his glass and said nothing. But he had watched everything the way Nolan carried himself, the way the girls moved, the way the whole room had deferred to a man in worn boots and grease-stained forearms. He filed that away, too. She didn't sleep well that night. The villa was quiet in the way expensive places are quiet. Insulated, climate-controlled, every surface smooth and deliberate. Elena lay on top of the covers at 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, and thought about the way Nolan's younger daughter had put her shells back in her pocket, one by one before leaving, as if she needed to make sure she hadn't left anything behind in a place that had just made her feel small. Elena had done that. She had walked into a stranger's lunch and made a 7-year-old feel small. She told herself it hadn't been intentional. She told herself that was the point that was exactly the problem. By morning, she had looked him up. It didn't take long. Cape Brindle was a small town, and Pierce Marine had a basic website with a phone number, a list of services, and a single photo of the shop taken on a bright day with the bay visible in the background. A few local news mentions filled in the rest. Nolan Pierce, formerly a marine systems engineer with a firm out of Portsmouth, had returned to Cape Brindle 6 years ago when his wife was diagnosed with a cardiac condition. He had opened the repair shop the following year. His wife, Rachel Pierce, had died 3 years ago in a collision on the bay involving a recreational vessel that ran a no-wake zone at speed. She was 34. She left behind a husband and 2 daughters. Elena read that last part twice. She put her phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood at the window for a while, looking at the water. She went to Pierce Marine the next morning without telling anyone. No security, no Paige, no Derek, no Conrad. She wore a plain white cotton shirt and canvas sneakers and pulled her hair back and took her own car, the understated one, the dark gray sedan she kept for exactly the situations where she didn't want to be looked at. The shop was already open when she arrived at 8:15. She could hear the sound of an air compressor running somewhere in the back. She stood at the entrance for a moment, then walked in. Nolan was at the workbench along the far wall, calibrating something on a motor mount. He looked up when he heard her footsteps on the concrete floor. His expression didn't change, which was its own kind of answer. "I wanted to apologize," Elena said. "In person, without an audience." "All right," he said. He put down the tool in his hand, but didn't move toward her. "What I did yesterday was thoughtless and cruel. I treated your family like—" She paused, choosing the word carefully. "Like scenery. And I'm sorry." Nolan was quiet for a moment. I appreciate you coming, he said. But an apology to me doesn't fix the part where my daughters sat there and didn't understand why a stranger thought they were funny. Elena nodded slowly. She had anticipated this. She reached into the bag over her shoulder and took out an envelope, cream-colored, sealed with Tessa and June written on the front in her own handwriting. I wrote them a letter, not an excuse, just an acknowledgement that adults make mistakes and that what I did wasn't their fault and wasn't about them. Nolan looked at the envelope for a long moment without taking it. Then he took it. He didn't say she was forgiven. He didn't say much of anything. But he walked to the old wooden desk in the corner of the shop, opened the top drawer, and placed the envelope inside next to a small brass pocket watch that sat alone in the corner of the drawer like something kept very carefully. Elena saw it. She didn't ask about it, but she understood instinctively that whatever that watch meant, it was the measure of everything that mattered to this man. Thank you for listening, she said, and left. Outside, walking back to her car in the morning heat, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief, not satisfaction, but the specific discomfort of knowing she had done the right thing and that it hadn't been enough. Not yet. She didn't send flowers. She didn't wire money to the shop or arrange anything through intermediaries, or show up with a gesture scaled to the size of her bank account. Elena Marlowe, who had spent 20 years solving problems by deploying resources, made a decision that did not come naturally to her. She would start small. She came back to Pierce Marine on a Thursday afternoon, carrying a paper bag with 4 lemonades from the stand down at the harbor. 1 for herself, 1 for Nolan, 2 for whoever else was working. She set them on the workbench without ceremony and asked if there was anything she could do to help. Nolan's lead mechanic, a barrel-chested man named Walt, looked at her like she'd asked to perform surgery. Nolan said nothing for a moment, then handed her a rag and pointed to a row of small engine parts soaking in a tray of degreaser. Those need to be wiped and sorted by size, he said. Smallest on the left. She did it without complaint. She broke 2 nails and got grease on her shirt and didn't mention either. She came back the following Tuesday, and the Thursday after that. It was June who warmed to her first, which surprised everyone, including June herself. The girls came to the shop most afternoons. In summer, Nolan didn't have reliable after-school care during the off-season, and the marina was safer than leaving them home alone. Tessa usually brought a book or her star maps and occupied a corner. June orbited the machinery the way other children orbited playgrounds. One afternoon, Elena was struggling with a stuck bolt on a valve cover, while Walt watched with arms folded and unhelpful commentary. June appeared at her elbow without announcement, studied the bolt for a moment, then said quietly, "You're turning it the wrong direction. It's reverse-threaded." Elena stopped. "How do you know that?" June pointed to a small stamp on the bolt head. "Dad showed me. Reverse thread means righty-loosey." Elena turned it the other way. It came free immediately. "Thank you," Elena said. June nodded, already moving on to something else, as if mechanical competence was simply the baseline for existing in the world. After that, June sometimes worked alongside Elena in the afternoons, not talking much but present, handing tools, correcting mistakes with the minimal, precise language of someone twice her age. Tessa took longer. But one evening, when Elena mentioned offhandedly that she'd read about the Harbor Lights Summer Academy, a 6-week program for gifted kids covering marine science, astronomy, and engineering, and that she thought Tessa might find the astronomy module interesting, Tessa looked up from her star map for the first time in an hour. "You actually know what it covers?" Tessa asked. "I looked it up," Elena said. Tessa studied her for a moment, with the evaluating look she'd inherited from her father. Then she went back to her map. But she didn't leave the room. A week later, Elena brought Nolan the Harbor Lights application and information packet. She set it on the workbench and took 3 steps back, as if to demonstrate she wasn't going to stand over him while he read it. "I'd like to sponsor both of them," she said. "Full program. No conditions, no announcements, no press. The paperwork would go through you. You'd control everything." Nolan looked at the packet without picking it up. "They're not a charity project," he said. "I know that. I don't need someone to swoop in and fix things." "I know that too." She kept her voice even. "I'm not trying to fix anything. Tessa wants to study astronomy, and June could build a working engine by the time she's 10. The program exists. I have the means to make it accessible. That's all this is." Nolan was quiet for a long moment. "I'll read it," he said finally. "I'll decide." "Okay," she said, and she left it at that. He did read it. He called the program director himself, asked questions for 40 minutes, checked the staff credentials, reviewed every liability form. 3 days later, he signed the enrollment papers. His signature, his decision, his terms. He didn't thank Elena directly, but the next Thursday, when she arrived at the shop, there was a lemonade already sitting on the workbench, on her side of the tray. She didn't mention it. Neither did he. In the margins of all of this, barely visible Conrad Vale appearing at the harbor coffee stand one morning, standing near the marina fence for longer than the view warranted. Sitting at a table outside the cafe, directly across from the Harbor Lights building, on the day Tessa and June attended orientation. The same building he had already identified during his first week reconnaissance. He spoke to no one. He checked his phone. He left. Just a man killing time in a summer town, or so it seemed. The Cape Brindle Sailing Festival happened every year on the 3rd weekend of July. 2 days of decorated boats, shoreline vendors, live music on the dock, and the kind of collective good mood that only exists in small coastal towns when the weather cooperates. Handmade pennant flags stretched between lampposts along the waterfront. Families spread blankets on the grass above the seawall. The smell of grilled corn and salt air mixed together in a way that made people feel. At least for a weekend that everything was essentially fine. Elena had agreed to serve as the festival's primary sponsor before she fully understood what that meant in a town like Cape Brindle. She'd written the check from her phone in 30 seconds. What she hadn't anticipated was that sponsorship here meant showing up, setting up, carrying things, talking to people, being present in the specific, unglamorous way that small-town events required. There were no event staff to interface with on her behalf. There was just the harbor master, a volunteer committee of 7, and a folding table that needed to be moved 40 feet to the left. She moved the table. Nolan was there from early morning, leading the team responsible for preparing the parade boats, 12 vessels that would sail the length of the bay in formation at sunset. He worked the way he always worked, without announcement, without complaint, completely absorbed in the mechanical problem in front of him. By noon, he had diagnosed and fixed a fuel delivery issue on 3 separate boats that the owners hadn't known existed. Tessa and June were stationed at the junior science exhibit near the pavilion, presenting a small display they'd made through Harbor Lights, Tessa's hand-drawn star chart of the summer sky, June's annotated diagram of a single-cylinder marine engine. They wore matching white sneakers and took their subject matter very seriously. Elena moved through the day at the edge of things, helping where asked, staying out of the way where not. She had gotten better at reading the difference. It was late afternoon, an hour before the boat parade, when she saw it. She was standing near the refreshment tent, holding a paper cup of iced tea she hadn't drunk, watching the harbor. Nolan was at the end of the main dock, talking to an older fisherman named Gerald, who had been bringing his boat to Pierce Marine for 11 years. Gerald was gesturing broadly, laughing, one hand on Nolan's shoulder. Further down the dock, two teenage boys were asking Nolan something about the rigging on one of the parade vessels. He walked over, showed them, stepped back, let them try it themselves. A woman from the harbor committee came by to confirm the speaker setup. A group of younger kids recognized Nolan and ran over simply to be near him, the way children do with adults they trust completely. He crouched down to their level and answered whatever they were asking with his full attention, as if what a 7-year-old wanted to know was exactly as important as anything else happening. Elena watched all of this from 30 feet away and felt something shift in her chest. A quiet, disorienting recognition. She had come to Cape Brindle thinking she was the one with something to offer. She had looked at Nolan Pierce, the worn boots, the small shop, the single-income household, and somewhere beneath her conscious awareness, she had categorized him as someone who needed things. Resources, opportunity, access. What she saw now was a man who was the center of something real. Not because he had money or influence or a publicist who managed his image, but because he showed up every day and people knew it, trusted it, built their lives partially around the fact of his reliability. She was 41 years old, and she could not say the same about herself. The gossip started quietly, the way it always does in small towns. Not with a confrontation, but with a comment passed from one person to another, like a slow tide coming in. One of the Harbor Lights parents mentioned to another that it was interesting, wasn't it, how Nolan Pierce's girls had gotten into the program right around the time he'd gotten friendly with Elena Marlowe. A man at the yacht club said something to Derek about Elena's summer project. A woman whose opinion mattered in certain Cape Brindle circles used the phrase charity case in a conversation she probably knew would be repeated. Nolan heard it the way you hear things in a town where everyone knows your name. Secondhand, then directly accumulating until he couldn't ignore it. He brought it up with Elena one evening, after the girls were in the truck, engine running. "People are talking," he said. "I know," she said. "It bothers me, not because of me, because of Tessa and June." Elena held his gaze. "I know that too. I need to know you understand the difference between helping someone and making them a part of your story." It was the most directly he had ever spoken to her. She didn't look away. "I'm trying to," she said. "I don't always get it right, but I'm trying." He nodded slowly. He got into the truck. He drove away. Elena stood in the empty parking lot for a moment, the festival lights reflecting off the water below the hill, and understood that she had just been given something rare, an honest answer to an honest question, with no softening and no flattery. She wasn't sure she had earned it yet, but she was going to try. Conrad Vale had not come to Cape Brindle to rest. He had come with a specific and patient anger, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that moves carefully through ordinary spaces and waits for the right moment. 8 months ago, Elena had handed him a termination letter, backed by a 40-page internal audit. He had signed the separation agreement because he had no choice. He had smiled through the exit meeting because he was already thinking about what came next. Before he'd even unpacked his bags at the Cape Brindle rental, he had made one call to a private investigator named Russ Adler, who had done discreet work for him before. Conrad explained what he needed: documentation of Nolan Pierce's daily routine, his daughter's schedules, his connection to Elena. He told Russ to be patient, to be invisible, and to photograph everything. Russ had been at work since the first week of July. What looked like a man killing time at the marina fence was reconnaissance. What looked like a tourist sitting outside a cafe near the Harbor Lights building was surveillance. By the time the sailing festival was over, Conrad had Nolan's work schedule, the girls' program hours, the days Elena's car was parked outside Pierce Marine, and photographs, dozens of them, taken from distances that made them impossible to trace back to a single source. He knew what he had. He knew exactly how to use it. It began online the way most damage begins now. Quickly, anonymously, and with just enough truth to make the lie plausible. A post on a regional lifestyle blog, authored by an account with no profile photo and 6 weeks of history, raised questions about the Harbor Lights Summer Academy Scholarship Fund. It noted with carefully calibrated concern that 2 of the program's newly enrolled students were the daughters of a man who had been spending considerable time with the fund's primary donor. It did not make accusations. It simply asked questions. That was enough. The post was shared. Then a tabloid summer supplement picked it up. A photo ran alongside the article, Nolan and Elena at the sailing festival, side by side on the dock, not touching, simply standing near each other. The caption suggested proximity that the image didn't technically show. 2 days later, a second photo circulated. This one showed Tessa and June walking to the Harbor Lights building, backpacks on, sun in their eyes, completely unaware they were being photographed. The implication that Elena's generosity was transactional, that Nolan had leveraged his daughters to access her money, was never stated outright. It didn't need to be. The photos arranged the story themselves. Nolan saw the article on his phone on a Wednesday morning, sitting in his truck in the Pierce Marine parking lot before opening the shop. He read it twice. He looked at the photo of his daughters on a public sidewalk, candid, unsolicited, taken without his knowledge, and felt something cold move through him. He called Elena. "Did you know about this?" he asked. "I saw it this morning," she said. "I did not do this. I would never." "I know you didn't post it," he said. His voice was controlled but tight. "What I'm asking is whether this is the kind of thing that follows you. Whether this is just what your world looks like." A silence on the line. "Sometimes," she said quietly. "Yes." "My daughters' faces are in a tabloid, Elena." He said her name for the first time without distance in it, which made the sentence land harder. "I never agreed to that. I never agreed to any of that." "I know," she said. "I'm going to find out who did this." "That's not the point," he exhaled slowly. "The point is that I can't control it. Whatever you do, whatever I do, the moment I'm connected to you, they become targets. And I can't protect them from something I can't see coming." He ended the call. Elena sat with her phone in her hand in the villa kitchen, the bay bright and indifferent outside the window. She had already called her head of security in Boston the night before. What came back that morning was a name she already knew. Russ Adler, a PI with a history of work for Conrad Vail, and a payment trail that led directly back to a shell account Conrad had used before one. The internal audit had flagged 18 months ago. She picked up the phone again. This time, she called her attorney. The envelope was sitting on the front porch when Nolan got home Thursday evening. No stamp, no return address. Just his name written in block letters on the front. Nolan Pierce, in the kind of handwriting that is deliberately generic, deliberately untraceable. He almost stepped over it. He picked it up because June was behind him and he didn't want her to find it first. He waited until both girls were inside before he opened it. There were 3 photographs inside. Tessa and June at the harbor, taken from a distance with a long lens. Tessa pointing at something in the water. June crouched down, examining something on the dock. A second photo, the 2 of them walking out of the Harbor Lights building, backpacks on, laughing at something between them. A third, June alone at the edge of the marina fence, her back to the camera, looking out at the boats. Someone had been following his daughters. Not once, repeatedly, methodically. Starting from the very first week of summer, before he had any idea who Conrad Vale was or what he wanted. Beneath the photos, a single typed line. How far are you willing to go for a billionaire's attention? And how much of your daughter's safety are you willing to trade for it? Nolan stood on the porch for a long time. The sun was going down over the bay, turning the water orange and flat. Inside, he could hear Tessa arguing cheerfully with June about something inconsequential. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. Sounds he had organized his entire life around protecting. His hands were steady. That surprised him. He went inside, made dinner, helped with the dishes. Listened to Tessa explain a new theory she had about the Perseid meteor shower. He waited until both girls were asleep. Then he sat at the kitchen table in the dark, the 3 photographs face down in front of him, and opened the desk drawer. The brass pocket watch was there the way it always was. He picked it up and held it for a long time, not looking at it, just feeling the weight of it in his palm. He thought about Rachel, about the morning she died, how ordinary it had started, how he had kissed her goodbye at the door without any particular awareness that it was the last time. About the call that came 2 hours later, while he was under a boat engine with grease on his hands, completely unable to stop it. He had spent 3 years making sure nothing would ever blindside him like that again. He had built a life of manageable variables, small shop, small town, clear sight lines, no surprises. And now, a man he'd barely registered was holding photographs of his children, taken through a long lens, and using those photographs to threaten him. He put the watch back in the drawer. He closed it. He picked up his phone and called his friend Doug Ballard, who owned a fishing cabin in the marsh wetlands 20 miles outside of town. Doug answered on the second ring. Nolan asked if the cabin was empty. Doug said yes, and asked no questions, because that was the kind of friend he was. The next morning, Nolan loaded the truck before the girls were fully awake. He told them they were taking a few days off. No harbor lights, no marina, just the cabin in the marsh and maybe some fishing. Tessa asked if something was wrong. He said no. She looked at him the way she sometimes looked at him, with Rachel's eyes, patient and unconvinced, and then let it go. June brought her tools. He left Cape Brindle without contacting Elena. He drove the 20 miles of marsh road with the windows down and both girls quiet in the back seat, watching the landscape flatten out around them into something wide and unpopulated and still. For the first time in weeks, no one knew exactly where they were. That was the only thing that felt like safety anymore. Back in Cape Brindle, Elena received no answer when she called. No reply to her texts. The phone rang out to voicemail twice, then went directly on the third try. She sat at the kitchen table in the villa and understood with complete clarity what she had cost him. Not money, not reputation, not comfort. She had cost Nolan Pierce the one thing he had built his entire life to protect: the feeling that his daughters were safe. Elena did not call a press conference. She did not issue a statement through her communications team. She did not contact the financial journalists who covered Marlowe Capital and would have taken her call within the hour. She did not do any of the things she had spent 20 years learning to do when her name was being damaged in public. Because every one of those moves would have required putting Nolan's name and his daughters' faces back into the story she was trying to remove them from. Instead, she called the Cape Brindle Community Center and asked if she could use their meeting room on Saturday morning. She showed up with no prepared remarks, no legal team visible, no security detail stationed at the door. 11 local journalists attended. Elena sat at the table rather than standing behind a podium, which was deliberate. She spoke for 12 minutes. She said that a coordinated effort was underway to misrepresent the Harbor Lights Scholarship Fund and the families it served. She said the effort was designed by someone with a financial and personal grievance against her, and that the true target was not her reputation, but the privacy and safety of people who had no part in that grievance. She did not say Conrad's name. She did not say Nolan's name. She did not show the photographs of Tessa and June. She said documentation was being compiled and would be turned over to the appropriate authorities. Then she answered questions for 8 minutes, said thank you, and left. It was the most restrained public appearance of her professional life. It was also the most honest one. Sylvia Crane called that same afternoon. Elena knew the name well. Sylvia had served as Conrad's executive assistant for 4 years, precise, capable, and quiet. 14 months ago, she had submitted a formal request to transfer to another division of Marlowe Capital, citing a need for a change in work environment. Elena had approved the transfer without pressing for details, a decision she now recognized as a failure of attention. Sylvia asked if she could come to the villa. She arrived an hour later, carrying a laptop bag and the specific expression of someone who has been deciding whether to do something for a long time and has finally decided. She set a portable hard drive on the kitchen table. "I've had this for 8 months," she said. "I didn't know what to do with it. I do now." She explained that she had begun quietly documenting Conrad's activities after he asked her to falsify a series of vendor contracts, not for the first time, but for the first time she understood he would never stop. She had copied emails, recorded 3 phone conversations with Conrad's knowledge that he had been too arrogant to consider might be used against him, and retained copies of financial transfers she had been instructed to process through accounts she now knew were shells. The drive also contained contracts, 2 of them dated within the last 6 weeks, authorizing surveillance of Nolan Pierce, his business, and his daughters. There were time-stamped photographs matching the images from the envelope on Nolan's porch, along with the name of the PI Conrad had hired. And there was a planning document, 12 pages dated 3 weeks after Conrad arrived in Cape Brindle, outlining a strategy to use Nolan's connection to Elena as the mechanism for a public discrediting campaign. The document referred to Tessa and June not by name, but by the phrase, "the minor dependents." Conrad had not acted impulsively. He had planned this before Nolan Pierce had any idea Elena Marlowe existed. Elena read through the drive for 2 hours without speaking. Sylvia sat across the table and drank the coffee Elena had made and did not rush her. When Elena looked up, she said, "Why now?" Sylvia was quiet for a moment. "Because I saw the photo of those little girls in that tabloid," she said. "And I realized that staying quiet wasn't neutral anymore." Elena called her attorney. She called the Harbor Authority Ethics Committee chair. She called the Harbor Lights program director and explained in precise terms what had been done and what documentation existed. Then she drove to the marsh. She had Doug Ballard's number through the marina directory. She called him and asked as directly as she knew how whether Nolan and his daughters were safe. Doug said yes. She asked if Doug would tell Nolan one thing. Not a message, not an explanation, just one thing. "Tell him that I know what's on the drive, and that his name and his daughters' names will not appear in any of it when it goes to the authorities. I'll make sure of that." She sat in her car on the side of the marsh road afterward, the engine off, the windows down, the sound of water moving through the reeds somewhere she couldn't see. She thought about the planning document and the phrase, "the minor dependents," and felt something harden in her that had no name, but was not going away. She had walked into Nolan Pierce's life as a joke. She was not going to let Conrad Vale walk out of it as the ending. Nolan came back to Cape Brindle on a Tuesday. He had been at Doug's cabin for 5 days. 5 days of marshlight and fishing rods, and June disassembling Doug's outboard motor on the dock while Tessa read star charts on the porch. 5 days of cooking simple meals and sleeping without setting an alarm, and thinking clearly for the first time in weeks. Doug had delivered Elena's message on the 3rd day. Nolan had listened without responding, gone back to the dock, and sat there for a long time, watching the water move through the marsh grass. He thought about the planning document, the phrase, "the minor dependence," and felt something settle in him like weight finding its center. This was not about Elena's world being careless. This was about a specific man who had made a specific decision to use his daughters as instruments. That was different. That required a different response than hiding. That night, he went to the small shelf above the cabin's fireplace where he'd set Rachel's pocket watch when he unpacked. He always brought it the way some people bring a photograph. He picked it up and held it in the dark, the same way he had at the kitchen table 5 nights before. But this time, the question he was asking himself was different. Not, how do I keep them safe? He already knew the answer to that. You didn't keep people safe by disappearing. You kept them safe by standing between them and the thing that was coming. He told the girls to pack their bags. The formal inquiry into the Harbor Lights Scholarship Fund was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon at Cape Brindle Town Hall. A public proceeding convened by the Harbor Authority Ethics Committee, with representatives from the program, legal counsel for Marlowe Capital, and 3 community board members present. Conrad had not anticipated Nolan walking through the door. He was seated near the back when Nolan came in, composed, unhurried, wearing the same kind of clothes he always wore, as if he had simply come from the shop. He scanned the room, found Conrad's face, held it for exactly 1 second, and then took a seat at the front table beside Elena's attorney. Elena was already there. She looked at Nolan when he sat down. He gave her a single nod. She looked back at the committee. When it was Nolan's turn to speak, he stood up and spoke without notes. He said that Elena Marlowe had entered his life badly, with arrogance and thoughtlessness, and that he would not pretend otherwise. He said that what followed had been slow and imperfect, and often uncomfortable, and that he had not made it easy, and that was also true. He said that his daughters had been enrolled in the Harbor Lights program because they were qualified, and because Elena had offered support in a way that gave him full control and asked nothing in return. And that anyone who had characterized that differently had done so deliberately and dishonestly. Then he said, "A man in this room hired someone to photograph my daughters without my consent, and used those photographs to threaten my family. He did that not because of anything my daughters did or anything I did. He did it because he wanted to hurt someone else, and we were close enough to use." The room was very quiet. "I'm not here to protect a billionaire's reputation," Nolan continued. "I'm here because my daughters deserve to have the record say clearly that they were used as tools in someone else's scheme, and that the adults in the room said so out loud." He sat down. Sylvia Crane presented the hard drive documentation through Elena's legal team. The committee reviewed the contracts, the time-stamped photographs, the planning document, with its clinical reference to the minor dependence. Conrad's attorney objected 3 times. The committee chair overruled each objection with increasing brevity. By the end of the session, the matter had been referred to the county district attorney's office. Conrad was escorted from the building. He did not make a statement. He did not look at Nolan on his way out. The tabloid that had run the original story issued a retraction the following morning. The lifestyle blog post was taken down. Harbor Lights released a statement confirming all scholarship awards had been made on merit, reviewed by an independent panel, with records available for public inspection. 3 days later, Elena announced that the Marlowe Capital Scholarship Fund would be restructured under a new independent board. 7 members, drawn from the Cape Brindle community, including teachers, tradespeople, and parents. She would contribute funding. She would hold no decision-making authority. It was the first major institutional decision of her career that she had made by deliberately stepping back from the center of it. She had always believed that power meant being the one who decided. She was learning slowly that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was hand the decision to someone else. The weeks after the hearing were quiet, in the way Cape Brindle is quiet at the end of summer. Not empty, but settling. The tourist crowds thinned. The mornings came in cooler. The light on the bay shifted from the hard white blaze of July to something softer and more golden, the kind of light that made everything look like it was being remembered rather than experienced. Nolan finished the boat. It had been sitting in the back corner of Pierce Marine for 2 years. Rachel's boat, a 22-foot wooden sloop she had bought before they were married and spent 3 summers restoring by hand. After she died, he had covered it with a tarp and not touched it. Not because he couldn't face it, but because it hadn't felt like the right time. Some things needed to wait until you were ready to do them properly. He worked on it for 3 weeks in the early mornings before the shop opened, while the girls were still asleep. He replaced the deck hardware, re-caulked the hull seams, refinished the teak with 3 coats of oil applied by hand. He installed a new compass in the original brass housing Rachel had kept in a box in the garage. On the last morning, he stood back and looked at it for a long time. And then, he painted the name on the transom in clean white letters. Second Harbor. Tessa asked what it meant when she saw it. "It means there's more than one place you can come home to," Nolan said. Tessa thought about that for a moment. "Is Miss Elena the Second Harbor?" Nolan looked at his daughter. "I think she might be," he said. Tessa nodded as if that was a reasonable answer and went back to her star chart. He and Elena had not seen each other since the hearing. They had exchanged a few brief texts, practical things, confirmation that the legal process was moving forward. A note from her that the Harbor Lights Board had been finalized. Nothing personal. The distance wasn't hostile. After everything that had happened, the threats, the hearing, the accumulated weight of a summer that had moved too fast, they both understood without saying it, that what existed between them needed room to settle before it could become anything else. Some things can't be rushed. Nolan more than anyone knew that. Elena had stayed in Cape Brindle. She had not announced it and had not explained it. She had simply not left. She ran along the waterfront in the mornings. She attended the Thursday farmers market on the town green. She was learning, slowly and with genuine difficulty, how to be somewhere without managing it. She did not contact Nolan. She understood that the next move was not hers to make. The Cape Brindle Lantern Festival happened on the last Saturday of August. A low-key local tradition in which paper lanterns were floated off the dock at dusk while the town gathered on the waterfront. No sponsors, no ticketing, just people and light and the end of summer. Elena arrived alone as the sun was going down, wearing a pale yellow sundress and canvas shoes, her hair loose. She carried a small wooden box. She found Nolan near the end of the main dock, standing with Tessa and June, the 3 of them watching the first lanterns drift out over the darkening water. She stopped a few feet away. June noticed her first and moved over without ceremony to make room. Tessa glanced up, then back at the water. Nolan turned. They looked at each other for a moment across the small remaining distance between them. Elena opened the wooden box. Inside, on a fold of white cloth, was a ring, simple silver, no stone, made by a craftsman on the far end of the harbor whose workshop smelled like metal and sawdust. Around the band, in small, clean letters, was engraved the Cape Brindle Lighthouse. She held it out in her open palm and looked at him steadily. "The first time I said it, I didn't know what I was asking. I thought it was nothing." She paused. "Now I know exactly what I'm asking. And I know it isn't nothing." Another pause. Marry me not so I can help you raise your daughters, but so we can build something together, the four of us, that belongs to all of us equally. The lanterns moved slowly across the water behind her, small lights spreading out across the dark. Nolan looked at Tessa. She was watching him with Rachel's patient eyes, and something else, a quiet permission. He looked at June, who had already gone back to watching the lanterns with her steady, unhurried attention, as if the answer were already settled, and she was simply waiting for the adults to catch up. He reached out and took the ring from Elena's palm. "Okay," he said. They were married 6 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, at the edge of the Pierce Marine dock. 30 people, folding chairs, on the weathered planking, string lights hung between the boat davits. The smell of salt and wood smoke, and the last warmth of the season in the air. Walt cried. Doug did not cry, but came close. Tessa read a passage she had written herself about navigation. June stood beside her father in a white dress and held his hand. It wasn't a fairy tale about a billionaire saving a struggling father. It wasn't a story about wealth learning to be humble for a season and then going back to normal. It was something quieter and more durable than either of those things. Two people who had seen each other clearly at their worst and their most defended, and had chosen, slowly and without guarantees, to stay. The tide came in as it always did. The lanterns from 3 weeks before were long gone, carried out past the breakwater and dissolved into the ocean. But the lights on the dock burned steadily, and the water was calm, and the four of them stood together at the edge of the bay as the sun went down over Cape Brindle for the last evening of summer. There's something worth holding on to in this story. The idea that real love doesn't begin with a rescue. It begins with respect. Nolan never needed saving. He needed to be seen. And Elena didn't become worthy of his trust by being wealthy or powerful or sorry. She became worthy of it by showing up quietly on an ordinary Thursday and asking nothing in return. If that's the kind of story you want more of, stories about dignity, about people choosing each other slowly and honestly, subscribe to this channel. New stories go up every week. We'll see you in the next one.